Well, good evening, everyone. It's good to be here. I'm TomKopchak. I'm with Hurricane Labs, and today I'm going to talk to you about forensics for the defense of your network. We all kind of heard about forensics before. Sounds like something cool, a lot of aspects in law enforcement. But there's a lot more to forensics when you apply it to defense. You can use forensic techniques for a whole lot more different things than just trying to analyze the machine for evidence. And I believe it's something that if you look at the techniques a little differently in a kind of creative and innovative way, you can generally really improve the security of your network at the same time. So just a little brief overview of who the heck I am. TomKopchak, worked for Hurricane Labs, been there about a year now. Prior to coming to Hurricane, I studied at the Rochester Institute of Technology, Computing Security Information Assurance for my master's, and undergrad was in Applied Networking and System Administration. So background in the security side of things and also in the networking side of things. For my master's thesis, which is currently in progress, I'm working on solid-state drive forensics, so some of the bleeding-edge forensics testing. And computer security has become one of my passions. Something that there's so many things that we can learn. There's so many things that change all the time, and it's not an environment where, or not a field where things are going to stand still. You're always going to be learning, always going to be experiencing something new, and it's dynamic and exciting, and happy to be here. And thank you for having me here. So whenever I tell someone that I do forensics, they're like, "Oh, cool, you do forensics, that sounds absolutely awesome." So what comes to mind when you hear about forensics? You got, just think of TV shows that deal with crime. There's crime scenes, you have evidence all over the place, criminals you're trying to bring to justice. Secret files that are hidden on devices, laptops, video game systems, and they have to play the right level to make an Excel spreadsheet pop up on their Xbox or something like that, because that's totally how it works. You have a neatly laid out trail of evidence that some clever enough detective is able to piece this all together and bring the criminal to justice. You, of course, have police chases, because everything has to have police chases. Gunfire, all those sorts of things. And everything is solved by the end of the TV show in 30 minutes or less. Commercials not included, of course. I hate to break it to you, forensics is not really that way in real life. Sorry. The truth is that evidence is something that can be very hard to come by. You're searching through gigabytes, maybe even terabytes of data, trying to find the proverbial needle in a haystack. And all of this evidence is something that needs to be completely documented and very carefully documented. You have to have a clear chain of custody, and you have to be able to record and prove in a court of law everything that was done on a piece of evidence. How many of us like documentation in this room? Woo! I think I have 2 hands in the audience. Congratulations. Forensics is all documentation. When you're in front of a court, in front of a jury, they're going to ask you everything you did. How did you prove to someone what you did? How do you know? And you need to convince them beyond a reasonable doubt that this person is either innocent or guilty based on the evidence that you discovered. In order to do that, you need to have very solid documentation. And that's, quite frankly, a pain. And of course, your cases involving the movie-like circumstances that people would actually care to watch on TV, they're few and far between. So it's not something that you're going to deal with on a regular basis. Maybe once in a lifetime, or maybe if you're lucky, more than once in a lifetime, you'll see something like that. But sadly and kind of disgustingly, a lot of the stuff that forensics investigators deal with is more of the child pornography, those sorts of things, which you really don't, not something anyone really wants to deal with. So that's kind of the truth of forensics. But I don't want to discourage you from that. Forensics is something that is very valuable. We talked about the law enforcement aspects of forensics. This is really important. I don't want to discount this at all. There have been so many cases that have had computer forensic evidence that have either made or broke the case. And this is equally important in investigations of individuals, as including, white-collar crime, breaches, cyber attacks, those sorts of things, where evidence about what happened and bringing someone or an organization to justice is very important. But kind of the emerging twist of forensics, and kind of what I want to focus on this evening, is the security aspects of it. And a couple things that forensics can be used for security are for application verification and penetration testing. Forensics penetration testing, and the example I'm going to look at a little bit later, involves encrypted laptops. Let's say a machine in your organization is stolen. How do you prove, beyond reasonable doubt again, that your information is not compromised? You know it's encrypted, but how do you prove that? And how do you know that it's safe? Also, application verification. How do you know, for example, that a developer says what their application is doing is what it's doing? Because, developers, they never lie, and they have all their code perfectly documented. That was a joke, just to make sure. But yeah, there's a lot of things that you can verify. So I want to start by just giving a kind of a high-level view of how forensics is involved and the different techniques. Do you have any questions about anything? Just, shout out, feel free to ask. We're here to have that dialogue too. So, traditional forensics, it all started looking at disks. You have your dead analysis of a machine, a hard drive. A lot of this involves searching for deleted, hidden files. And one of the key aspects of anything involving disks is the fact that your evidence must never change. Many times an investigator will do this by making an MD5 sum of the drive when they start, doing their investigation, working off an image, and being able to prove the MD5 sum is the same at the end. That way you can say, this evidence is what I had when I started, this is the same evidence when I'm done, nothing was changed in the process. A lot of these investigations, you are searching for a needle in a haystack. You're looking for tiny details, deleted files, hidden files, changed file extensions, everything like that where someone's trying to hide their tracks. Some people are a lot better at hiding their tracks than others, but plain fact is a lot of this is just trying to extract information, data mining from a disk itself. Now, new technologies, they are making this a little bit more challenging. Full disk encryption for one. The disk isn't easily searchable. You need to find a way to either decrypt it or get access to the machine in a decrypted state. And also solid-state drives, what I'm researching now. They behave a lot differently than your regular hard drives. They're more like computers with some intelligence on the drive itself, as opposed to just a piece of hardware that's sitting there with magnetic bits on it. So, progressing on from the disk side of things, as forensics has advanced as a field, and as more people have gone into the field and tried to gather more information from this, we've started looking at memory as well. Memory analysis is becoming increasingly important in forensics investigations because the plain fact is there is evidence that will only exist in memory. For example, when you go to a website and log in with a password, that password's stored in RAM. It's not going to be something that's written out to disk. So if you obtain the memory from the system, you can get things like passwords. Sometimes you can get things like encryption keys. And capturing this evidence is it's significantly different from a disk analysis, because in order to capture memory, you often have to modify the evidence to get the evidence. By that I mean there are tools written that run on a system that dump the RAM to for example, a USB drive or something like that. Installing the drivers for that, if you don't have a way to get them, if the disk isn't already attached, that modifies memory. Loading your program into memory modifies memory. So there's this whole area there's a big debate in the forensics community, is this acceptable? We're modifying evidence to get evidence. But it's generally accepted that the data in memory, it's worth the risk of doing some modification to that and being able to explain it, while still getting that evidence that you might not be able to get anywhere else. But all of this so far, we've been only focusing on the individual machine. Forensics can cover a lot more than that. And one of the expanded scopes for this are the idea of network forensics, where everything that's between the client machine and what they're trying to access is a valuable source of evidence that should be examined. The big word for this is logs. Logs, logs, logs of everything. For example, you might have firewall logs. These can show what IP addresses the machine's trying to connect to, what services are running. You might have DNS logs that'll tell you the exact websites and the host names that they're trying to get to. IDS logs can tell you if an attacker is trying to get in or if signatures are being hit on the intrusion detection system. You might even have packet captures depending on what information and what systems are running and how your network is set up. All of these can provide a really, really excellent source of information for everything that a machine's doing. A couple of examples for this. Web history. You can actually use packet captures and firewall logs to determine whether or not a machine is doing something on its own, or if a person's doing it. We all know about Google and Google Instant Search, for example. You start typing in the results, Google's trying to figure out what you want, displaying results one at a time. Looking at the timing, every time you type a keystroke, there's traffic being sent out from your machine to Google. Your logs will show, hey, I type, let's say I'm looking up forensics. I type F, sends F to Google, results come back. Type another letter. That letter goes out, I get more results. Using the timing of that, you can say, these were typed exactly 1/2 a second apart, for example. That can't necessarily be a person, because no one can type with that level of accuracy. Where if it's something that looks more characteristic of a human typing, you can say that's more likely that someone was actually doing that. The other thing where this is very useful in a law enforcement situation is location data. Apple devices such as iPads using Google Maps have a shockingly significant amount of location data embedded into them. This could be GPS information. This could also be information about what wireless networks you are associated to and their MAC addresses. Using this, even with location services turned off in the device, there's still this information that's sent out in packet captures. And you can have a pretty significant, solid, pretty much an idea of where the person's been based on that. And it's a very hard thing for the person to defend against with all that evidence against them. So that's more of a law enforcement look at it, but the network side of things is critical. And you can also use this in the case of breach analysis and even malware analysis or anything related to a system on your network to try to see what it's doing. But what we're here for, most of us, like Matt said, hopefully there aren't any police officers in the room because we don't want to get arrested or something like that. But hopefully most of you are going to be looking at this from a business perspective. How can forensics be useful for my business and my organization? It's a good thing you're here. Forensics techniques are useful for a whole lot more than just law enforcement. One of the advantages that you have when you're looking at this from a corporate perspective is you have a lot more flexibility. You don't have all those pesky laws to get in the way. Not that I'm saying that laws are annoying, but they have purposes. But in the case of a corporate investigation where you're trying to see how something's working, you don't really need to have documentation that'll stand up in court, which is good based on the amount of hands I saw that like documentation. You do have more flexibility, and you are actually able to experiment with evidence in the sense that you can play around with things and see what happens, how the evidence changes, and set up your own experiments and learn from that experiment. You also have the minimal legal issues, especially for research purposes. You're not trying to defend something in a court of law. So you don't have the overhead of dealing with a court of law. And we know how awesome the legal system is in that respect. So to not have to deal with that, have that on your back, it's a benefit. And you can still use the same techniques. So it's not only great for learning the forensics process, in case you're ever interested in looking at it from a law enforcement perspective, but it's also something that can be used to improve your network devices security and your system security as well. Now, there are quite a few commonalities between the corporate side of forensics and the law enforcement side of forensics. First and foremost, it's a time-consuming process. Anytime you're looking through a large amount of data for small amounts of data, it's going to take time. It's not something that's fast. It also requires attention to detail. These are, in some cases, gigabytes, terabytes of data, and you're looking for changes sometimes in the amounts of kilobytes or megabytes. Large amount of data to search through, very small amount of data to focus on. So being able to be someone who's focused on those details and able to recognize little changes is something that's beneficial. You can't avoid that thing, documentation. Whenever you do some kind of research involving forensics, you're going to need to have some form of documentation. Corporate doesn't have to be the best documentation, but you need to be able to demonstrate to someone else what you did, especially if you're trying to prove due diligence on an organization's part. You need to have some documentation that says, hey, this is what I did, and this is how I can prove that I did. And it's also important to consider the time involved when determining if it's necessary. You don't see the police doing a forensics investigation for every person who's pulled over for everything. There's a reason for that. They don't have time for it. You should think of it the same way in your organization. You're not going to necessarily do a forensics investigation on every system. But say you have a standard laptop platform and want to verify the encryption. That's something that you might want to look at using these techniques. So I've talked about this whole forensic stuff, but you want to know something useful. You want to see the practical applications. So that's what we're going to look at next. Some of the most useful practical applications of forensics in the corporate world are, first, forensic verification. In this case, the analysis of an application for determining if it stores information that's sensitive and how it stores information. There are a couple of cases where this could be used for PCI, for example, or health information. Let's say you have an application that collects information that's sent to a company for processing. So you're taking applications for credit cards. Or you're a doctor's office and you process forms on computers and send that off somewhere else. Your vendor says all of this data is either stored encrypted on the machine or it's not cached at all. Now, how do you prove that? You can do a forensics analysis of the machine and be able to determine if what they're saying is actually true or not. There's also forensic penetration testing. The example of this that we're going to talk about is the case of the encrypted laptop. Something's stolen, you know it's encrypted. You've deployed encryption, and you're fairly confident, and you can say you're completely confident that no one's going to be able to get anything off of it. But does that absolutely mean that no one's going to be able to get anything off of it? Not necessarily. And a forensics penetration test can help prove that or tell you where you can improve. There's also the case of malware and exploit and breach analysis. A lot of this goes into the network forensics side of things, but to be able to say, an incident happened on my network. What do I do to both be able to say what happened, how it happened, what can I fix in the future to keep that from happening again, and what information might have been compromised in the process. Now, the one word of caution, especially when we're looking at that third bullet point for the malware and exploit and breach analysis, is permission and knowing your limits. There are legal ramifications for some of these, especially anything that might involve criminal activity. You have to know your limits, and you have to know when you might need to involve law enforcement if it is something where there could be, for example, someone who violated a law that your company is responsible for reporting. So you don't want to start trying to investigate something, not necessarily know what you're doing, and cause evidence to be lost, evidence to be contaminated, and anything like that. So for those sorts of things, and if your organization is one of those organizations that requires a solid audit trail, clear documentation of anything like this, before just starting, hey, I'm going to start doing forensics on this stuff, make sure you know what you're doing. So why forensics? We talked about some of the ways you can use this, but why? One of the biggest ones, and most of us should know this idea of security not being a checkbox. Just because you check something doesn't mean it's secure. Turn on a firewall, it's not going to protect you against everything. You encrypt your laptop, It's not necessarily bulletproof. You can also simulate an actual attack from an attacker's perspective using the same tools and techniques that they might use. I like to call these, consider these a zero-knowledge attack. They have no idea about the organization. They don't know what system is running or anything like that, but they're going to do whatever they can to discover that. You can also identify the shortcomings before they become problems. It's much easier to deal with something internally or as the result of a penetration test, just like any network penetration test, than opposed to seeing your company's name on the front page of the newspaper and trying to answer to that. It's all about being proactive in this case, as opposed to suffering the consequences and trying to react. So for an actual forensics verification, you might want to look at an application that either takes in applications or processes personal information, something of that nature, and examine it for temporary or cache data that might be stored on the machine's hard drive. The plain fact is for this, you don't want to trust your developer's word on this. They might say this application doesn't do anything that would jeopardize your PCI compliance or your PHI compliance, anything like that. But they might be doing things that aren't necessarily the most sound in their programming. And you want to be able to verify this, especially in the case of your system being audited or your programs being audited. How do I prove that I know that these applications are doing what they should? And that shows due diligence on your part. And there's also the PCI, PHI implications. We have laws that we have to work within depending on what business we're in. And being able to prove this, that we tried to follow these laws and follow the restrictions and the regulations that they have to the best of our ability, really does help us out as individuals working in security. So in this case, for one of our clients, I did a forensics verification of an application. Set up a control image of this machine that was designed to be as simple as possible to test out the specific application. Whenever you're working with a controlled forensics environment, you have a lot of data, but you want to try to minimize the amount of data you need to look at as much as possible. So for this, I built a system with just the application, as few background processes as possible, pretty much bare bones application operating system, and that was what we were going to be looking at for our scope. This control image was something that I built a disk image of, saved it to a drive, was able to repeat the test case from the same spot all the time. Just like any scientific experiment, except from a forensics perspective. Each time I ran the application, I generate data, depending on the type of use case I was looking for. For a lot of, let's just say the case of an application for a credit card. You can put in a name that's somewhat interesting, so that you know that when you're looking for this data, there's no way that that could possibly be on there to begin with. You can run searches ahead of time, full text searches of the hard drive, and confirm that this data was not there ahead of time. And then what you can also do is, as you run the application, you can look at a forensics analysis of the MAC times of the files, the modified, the access, and the change times, and see every single file on a millisecond by millisecond basis of what is touched on the hard drive and what's accessed. You can also search for interesting data. As just a general rule of thumb, if you're looking for a good name to use for this, don't use Smith. There's a lot of references to that in the Windows code base that you'll see on a hard drive. But something else that's a little bit more unique, like, I don't know, Zoldrinis Ilgauskas, for example. That's not something that's necessarily in the code. I don't know if he's a Microsoft developer, but if he is, I'm sorry. Now let's look at something that's, I think this is the cooler side of things, but forensics penetration testing on an encrypted laptop. I'd like to set the scene for this and kind of hit it at this, but you have a laptop, you have a standard encryption deployment, it's stolen. Someone ran off with it. How do you prove and how do you know that the information on there is secure? Forensics penetration testing is the solution. There's a couple different forms of penetration testing that you can perform on this type of device. The first and most effective one and the most realistic one is your zero knowledge attack. This is identical to a real attack. The attacker who's investigating the machine, or the investigator, in this case me, you're looking at the machine from the same perspective as someone who would have actually stolen the machine. You don't know anything about the company. You don't necessarily know anything about what software is on the machine until you try to actually look at the machine and examine it. Everything that you try to develop for this penetration test and all your evidence is obtained from that machine only, and you build your case from there. You can also do authenticated testing. This allows you to test certain specific scenarios. For example, what happens if this application is running or if this machine is connected to a network? Can I do some memory analysis while the machine's running and possibly gain access to it? Because not every machine that's stolen is going to be completely shut off. So it allows you to look at it from different perspectives. So in this case, for one of the forensics penetration tests I did for a client, we were given a fully encrypted laptop. The administrator who gave this to me was completely, absolutely confident that nothing could be retrieved or leaked from the system. It was secure. We were not going to get into it. Absolutely, end of story. My responsibility was to come up with a way to either prove that the system was secure or to find a weakness, find some chink in the armor that we could go for. When this machine was stolen, it was powered off. So there wasn't any memory evidence that we could gather at that point in time. So everything we needed to do involved the drive. First thing I did, made a full disk image using a write blocker. Also made a software disk image and never did any work on the hard drive at all, directly. This is just sound forensics technique. Whenever you're encountering a disk that you're investigating, you don't want to ever modify it in any way. This actually was the key for this investigation, actually. The scratch disk allowed us to restore the data as much as we wanted, and we'd have a snapshot of the exact condition of the machine the way it was given to us. The other thing that's neat about never working off the disk is there is absolutely no knowledge to the third party that anything was done to the machine at all. For example, let's just say this was a bait machine that they wanted to try to see if something would be done to. Let's say the organization, they knew they took an MD5 sum and a SHA-1 hash of the drive to see, hey, does anyone power this on? Is anything changed? Because as soon as the system starts booting, it's going to change the hard drive in some way, shape, or form. You're touching files. Doing it this way, there was no evidence of that. So we could give the machine back to them, and let's just say they're trying to do a report on this and say the machine wasn't even turned on, all of the information of our clients is safe, you guys have nothing to worry about. And then everything pops up on the front page of the internet. But we'll get there. The initial reconnaissance of this showed that you had a laptop, obviously. Standard interfaces, nothing special, no special hardware or anything like that. And semantic endpoint encryption for your encryption solution. Just standard full disk encryption, corporate deployment. Nothing really all that special, but pretty much it's encrypted. That's how it works. Now the breakthrough that I discovered for this was a grace period for pre-boot authentication. There was a window of time on this system where it was allowed to boot up normally without having to enter a passphrase. There was a timeout that also existed, and the passphrase was required after this timeout. Think back to the whole idea of the disk images. The disk had no sense of time. So by repeatedly re-imaging our scratch disk using the original file, we could eventually, trial and error, I found the window for when pre-boot off was not required. Since the disk had no sense of time, and I had a clean backup that I could go back to whenever I wanted, I could work on this machine indefinitely. The other thing that I noticed once I finally discovered this grace period, the Windows booted up completely to a login prompt. Whenever you see an encrypted machine that has an operating system running, you know that there is some kind of decryption that's taking place. So because a processor and memory they're not going to be working on the encrypted data. They have to understand it in the native language. So there is decryption that's happening when I saw that operating system. And at that point, you don't have to worry about attacking the encryption directly. You can look at the operating system and kind of circumvent the whole idea of encryption while still working on an encrypted drive. So to mount the attack in this case, since I had full control of the machine and could do whatever I wanted, once again, reduce the scope of data you need to work with. So I took the machine down from 2 gigs to 512 megs of RAM. You immediately cut the amount of data that I need to look at 4 times less. A lot easier, and because the machine's still booting up, it's not like I'm losing any information. The RAM information is transient anyway. There was a FireWire interface on this machine, and FireWire allows for direct memory access, DMA. The lowest 4 gigs of RAM on any machine with a DMA interface is able to be accessed directly. So in this case, with only 512 megs of memory, using FireWire and the beauty that is Windows plug and play, I could use another Linux machine, access into the memory, and pretty much copy the running RAM off of the system onto my system. In that case, you have the decryption key and anything that's running in RAM. But even better, there's this tool that's called Encryption that lets you attack the memory structure completely. So using FireWire and injecting code into Windows as it was running, I replaced the part of Windows that's responsible for password checking. That way, login name administrator, password, blah, 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 enter, full admin access. Encrypted machine, no idea what the password was, exploiting the running operating system by modifying memory, nothing on the disk at all. It compromised an encrypted laptop completely. This was a machine that the person who gave it to me was completely confident that there was no way that they could get this information ever off of it. And I was able to give them everything that was on this machine. So you look at this and you'll think, oh my God, encryption failed. But that's not the case. Encryption did not fail. I didn't need to break the encryption. What I was able to do in this case was leverage the configuration oversights and be able to essentially chain 3 different things that were maybe not the best decisions in setting up the machine that could be all chained together in order to mount an attack and completely compromise the system. Just like any penetration tester would do on a corporate network penetration test, just directed at a machine. Now that being said, the decryption key could still be in the memory that we compromised, but why bother cracking encryption or trying to figure that out when you're in the machine already? An attacker is not going to try the harder way when they already have the easier way and they have all your information anyway. This was one of those cases of convenience versus security. We're always facing trade-offs in this industry, but that convenient step of not making a user do pre-boot authentication every time and providing a window was pretty much the one link in this chain that allowed the whole cascading attack to happen and allowed the security of the system to ultimately fail. And the important emphasis on this is it was a completely zero-knowledge attack. If I had just stolen this machine and this wasn't a penetration test, I could have gotten the exact same result, knowing nothing about the client, nothing about our customer. And that was a fully encrypted machine that was completely compromised. So the important thing when we're looking at forensics, think of forensics for the defense, one system at a time. You don't know what your system vulnerabilities are until they're tested. That's what penetration tests are for. Think of penetration tests, all traditional way is still incredibly valuable, but forensics penetration tests as a different approach, something that you can try against your network. They have the same purpose as your traditional penetration test, but they look at things differently. Leveraging the techniques of law enforcement and penetration testing, and also forensics techniques at the same time. And like any penetration test, you're able to learn from and improve from the mistakes before they become something that's really going to bite you later down the road. That's why we all do penetration tests. It's much better to have someone that you hire tell you what you're doing wrong than someone who you have to pay and who's going to make your company not exist by compromising your security. So just a couple conclusions. I think we've driven this point home by now, but forensic techniques, they're not just for law enforcement. They're something that can be used in the business as well. And I want you to, if anything that you've gotten out of this presentation, think of forensics as more than just bringing criminals to justice. It's something that you can definitely use to supplement your security package and improve the security of your systems and your networks. And also provide evidence of due diligence in the event of an incident. Just the customer we did the forensic penetration test from. On their retest, they did a whole lot better. And they corrected the oversights that we were looking at and forced pre-boot authentication, disabled interfaces that would allow for DMA. And in the event that one of their laptops is ever stolen, they have the evidence that, yes, we did this forensic penetration test. Yes, we made these changes, and we're this much more confident that a system that is encrypted is secure. And that peace of mind is something that's incredibly valuable. It's really important in this business to have someone else test your security, or for you to test your security before someone else does. And the forensics penetration testing and forensics for security exactly accomplishes that. So with that, take a moment to wrap things up and answer any questions from the audience, but I appreciate your attention and thank you for the opportunity to share this with you.
Why don't you talk a little bit about the tools you use to do this stuff? You talked about multiple items before that you referenced without naming them.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of tools. One of them for disk imaging, we have a forensics write blocker that we'll use. What a write blocker is it's a device that's used for cloning hard drives, but it's physically impossible of making, or physically impossible to make any changes on your source disk by design. So that way, if you need to make a clone of a drive, you can be really careful and put it in a machine and use something like Clonezilla or Ghost to make an image. But by using a write blocker, you have a lot more protection against doing something accidentally that might damage the evidence that you're looking at. So that's the hardware side of things. A lot of the analysis can be done with things that are either in Backtrack or the Kane live CD for forensics. Even the basic Unix tool strings is a lot more useful than you'd think. When you're searching through large amounts of data for text, it's a pain in the butt for everything to run, but you can pull out individual bits of information off of a file, off a massive disk image, and compare information that way. Memory analysis, for example, you don't have a file system. So that standard structure that you'd be looking for, you have to try to find information and carve data out of it. And with tools that for file carving, you can actually pull images, like pictures, in that sense, out of memory and rebuild them based on the structures that exist in RAM. So there's a lot of different tools that are available on the Linux side of things for forensics that you can get your feet wet with this and not actually spend any money, which is nice. The Inception tool is something that I found when I was looking through this forensics penetration test, and it's really awesome. The whole idea being that it's designed to dump RAM on pretty much any system you encounter. So let's just say someone, at a coffee shop goes to the restroom with their machine locked. You run over there, plug your FireWire cable into the machine, dump the RAM, walk away, or exploit the operating system to make their password not work, install something on their machine and walk away. If you're doing modification of RAM, you don't actually leave any evidence on the machine that you did anything, which is really slick. And the tool is very, very automated in that sense that it allows you, it searches for the correct patterns in RAM and knows how to exploit, I believe it's Linux, Mac, and Windows operating systems, all from one system. So that's something that, if you're interested in this, definitely take a look at it. Yes?
I have a question about the scratch disk process you mentioned. So you imaged the disk and you said you created a scratch disk.
Yes.
And so my question is did you essentially just use the same drive size and things of that nature when you created your scratch disk?
I just used a bigger one
Okay.
because first thing, this wasn't an investigation, so it didn't need to be exactly the same. But if you're making a disk image, you can either use something like DD, and then you'll have a perfect image.
Right.
If you actually want to have something that you can put in a machine, as long as you put it at the beginning of the drive, it doesn't matter if there's a bunch of empty space at the end.
Sure. So that leads me to my next question.
Okay.
How were you booting the disk? Were you taking that scratch disk and booting it?
Yeah,
But how did you know that you weren't modifying the disk every time you booted it?
I was.
Okay, so
That-
you're
that-
purposely doing that.
Yeah, that was
Okay.
the distinction between legal forensics and this kind of forensics, where you actually are modifying the data in the sense of trying to figure out.
So let's say
something.
you had to get into an encrypted drive, and there was no suspect or whatever to give you that password to decrypt the drive. So how would you do that in that case?
You're pretty much screwed.
Okay.
Encryption is not designed to be something that's easily broken. And to be honest with you, when my manager told me, hey, you're going to do this encrypted laptop analysis, I was like, the FBI can't even get into machines. How am I going to be able to do this?
Okay.
So, yes, once the machine is in that lock state, it is incredibly difficult you can throw, all kinds of stuff that, none of us combined have resource-wise at it, and not necessarily are going to be able to get into it.
And then last question.
Sure.
What's the major difference between the solid state disk and then your typical magnetic disk when you're doing forensics?
A hard drive is stupid. A solid-state drive is smart.
Okay.
That's one of the biggest differences. And I'm still in the process of doing all this research, so I will have more information in the time moving on.
Why don't you at least explain the difference between stupid and smart?
Okay, stupid and smart. A hard drive, if you plug it in and don't put you just put power on it, it's going to sit there spinning, and it's just going to be laying there. I'm a hard drive. That's how hard drives are. They're dumb, especially when they lose all your data and crash. But that's another story. Solid-state drive, they have a controller on there, and they have blocks of flash memory. And that controller, you can almost think of a solid-state drive as like a mini SAN for your laptop. There's all kinds of wear leveling, so moving data around so you're not wearing out individual spots of the flash memory. There's also the aspect of deduplication that happens in some flash drive or some solid-state drives, where you're trying to reduce the amount of data. The whole idea, from an engineering perspective, at least for a solid-state drive, is you want to reduce the amount of writes and erase cycles as much as possible. So the controller does a lot of logic behind the scenes that's transparent to the operating system, modifying the flash memory. And there's also the idea of garbage collection too for solid-state drives. So when you delete a file, on a hard drive, it's not ever deleted unless you specifically have software that's going to wipe that spot of the disk. Now on a solid-state drive, it knows enough about the operating system, especially if trim's enabled, that command, where this software, this file is deleted. When I have some spare controller cycles where there's not I/O going on, I'm going to preemptively move things around that are in that block to another block with free space and completely restore that block so it's ready to go. Because the slowest operation on SSD is wiping the block. So that's all background things. So a solid-state drive has the potential for doing things on its own, whereas a hard drive, it won't. That's kind of the difference.
And one last thing.
Sure.
If you can't afford a write blocker, Kane or the SANS SIFT workstation, or whatever it's called, you can mount the drive read-only.
Yeah, even DD, if you do it right, and make sure you get your IFs and your OFs right. Whoops. Yeah, basically. But when I was studying forensics and teaching forensics labs back when I was a graduate student, we didn't have write blockers for everyone. So, and that's also the best way. When you're a student learning how to do forensics, that's when you want to mess up the DD and never do it again. So you can definitely do those things. You just have to be careful. Say, for example, you accidentally boot the machine and then it starts loading, then you've contaminated that evidence. So the write blocker protects against that.
Those things have really dropped in price anyway, right? You get them
The one we use is still like $500,
yeah,
so
they really,
it's not cheap, but if you're doing this kind of work, it's pretty essential. Just to have that layer of protection.
I've got another solid state question, if you don't mind.
Okay, I'll try my best.
So, I think my group at work, we deal with decommissioning stuff to make sure it's decommissioned securely.
Mm-hmm.
If I recall correctly, and it's been a while since we've looked, but NIST doesn't have a recommended way for securely wiping a solid state drive. Is that, I mean, other than punching holes through it, is there?
Well, the issue with solid-state drives is, I'm sure you're familiar with the secure erase command.
Yeah.
For traditional hard drives. Not all the vendors implement that correctly, which is something that's I have to deal with for the research side of things too, is how do I restore a solid-state drive to a state where I know it's okay, which working through the controller and not desoldering chips, you can't necessarily say for sure. But there was a research paper that maybe about a year and a half old, or maybe a year old, where they actually did analyze the chips and pulled them out and looked at the data. You know, you write tests billions of times on the drive, do a secure erase, and I think it was more than half of the SSDs that they were still able to find tests in them, even on a secure erase drive. So pretty much you want to like secure erase it, you know, same thing you do for any hard drive. Make it, you can't even force the whole SSD to rewrite everything because a 60 gig SSD has like 62 gigs of memory in it, or 64 gigs and multiples of 8. So you have that spare area that's being used, so you can't necessarily overwrite any of it. Flash memory is basically indestructible. So even if you like blow it up, there still could be like, you know, that one social security number that's still in the flash chip somewhere. So it's an interesting area of things.
But basically no.
There's no hard fact that says this is going to be, you know, you can make it really hard just like anything. But with that in mind,
Shredded the sun.
that might be cost prohibitive.
Yeah.
Shredded?
That's what we do.
Pretty
It's a
much.
huge waste of money. Because with traditional hard disks, I think we do multiple rewrites.
Well,
you need to do that, but
Think about it from this perspective. There has been absolutely zero evidence or any case that anyone has ever come forward with ever of a hard drive that's been erased once of having data recovered off of it.
yeah.
So they have all these things like you need to overwrite it like 40 bajillion times.
I read that a year ago.
all
Yeah.
at once.
The article that you're thinking of with the 35 pass wipe,
Yeah.
that's based on old hard drives. Modern hard drives are different. Yes.
I thought the issue with SSDs is they have an intelligent controller,
Yeah.
which makes it independent of any operating system.
Exactly. A SSD
so
is
if
smart.
you run the garbage routine and you told it to wipe the drive, there should be nothing there.
Should be. You're once again relying on the vendor to implement that correctly.
It's not the vendor, it's the hardware.
Well, the vendor of the controller.
It's the standard of the manufacturer.
Yeah, exactly. When the controller gets that command to secure erase,
Worse than the cold.
how is the firmware in that drive handling that secure erase? That's the issue.
But I understand there's no forensic software that really can properly recover full files.
Because you're going through the controller, yes. So the research I'm looking at is primarily if you're an investigator who is not going to be desoldering the chips and doing that sort of analysis, what kind of information in different states of an investigation are you going to be able to get information off of the drive, and how is it going to differ from your standard hard drive? That's what I'm looking at. More to come.
Will you say that?
I think you already covered it. He corrected himself.
All right, well, thank you, Tom.
You're welcome.
So, just as a general gauge of usefulness, how many done it more than once, or at least once.
What do you mean?
3, 4.
Actually,
You should do a gauge of interesting parts as well.
What's that?
You should do a gauge of interestingness as well.
Okay. Is this interesting? Okay. There were more hands there than who actually did it. So, because this is a forum and we do have a little extra time, I saw a few hands who have done this. Have you guys done this for evidentiary purposes? No? Anyone who has?
Yeah, I did. When I did, I haven't done it in a few months now, but I was doing it both for legal, HR, and for our own internal testing purposes. So luckily though, none of the evidence that I worked on though was directly in a court case. It was all settled before it got to the courts.
Okay. So I guess what I'm more looking for is just kind of some people who have done this before with some expertise. What kind of challenges do you guys run into when you do this?
It's tedious and boring. Because it's the same thing over and over again. It's, in the corporate environment when I dealt with it, it was what website did they go to and were they looking at porn? And that was probably 90% of the cases I had to look at. When I was doing
How
forensics.
long they were on?
Sometimes it was scary porn, like not bad, like he needs to go to jail porn. It's just like, why did you take a picture of yourself in that picture?
So
And most of the time it wasn't really interesting. The really interesting stuff was when we got like malware, and that was very rare and not that common. So that was fun.
Yeah, I'd say
e-discovery was a big generator too of other things. So looking for emails.
A big problem we have is doing this stuff globally. How do you get your images around without shipping drives? When you're dealing with 2 terabytes of image drives that you don't really want to mess with it, right?
Mm-hmm.
You need your integrity. It gets to be really, really inconvenient when you're having people in different states looking at the data.
I imagine too, if you're shipping those drives around, the chain of custody forms would kill it.
Can I ask what type of tool were you using
For what part?
for the doing drives remotely, doing things remotely?
I was using the laptop sitting next to me,
Okay.
so I didn't have to deal with any of that distance side of things.
I think the guy up there was saying that he had to deal with distance.
Well, it's distance from analysis standpoint, not
Right.
not the actual data. Well, the data, but not the customer's version of it.
Okay. Because I had to deal with end users that were in other parts of the world, on the other side of the country, on the other side of the globe for that matter, where I had, luckily we had a deep pocketbook and we could afford in-case enterprise, so we had an agent that was on the computer that would allow us to do a remote capture of the drive, and then we could just put it to a drive there locally and then have it shipped over to us, or we could just SCP it over as time permitted. That's one way that I know we tackle it. But again, that requires a deep pocketbook to afford that software.
Yeah, Encase isn't cheap.
No, it's not cheap, but it's very effective.
I understand from one of the BCI investigators, they say foremost it has a remote capability of grabbing an image.
I'm trying to remember if I've used that before. Most of the stuff I've worked with is more local, so not necessarily in that situation, but
The investigator has done it from his site to anywhere in the state.
yeah, that's more something I haven't worked with, so
Hey, he's the investigator, I'm not gonna argue with him.
yeah.
Has anyone ever had to do it for an actual breach report? That's a good one. How fun was that? See,
Especially when I found out that the breach came from a previous employer on a banking site.
that's how much you like your previous employer, I guess.
Yeah, I don't think he likes me very much now, but
And I guess that's one of the things about being a third party and going to do this stuff is that we don't actually have to be around for the aftermath of a lot of these things. So it's always interesting to hear how people handle it internally. But yeah, I think that's about all we have for tonight. Like I said, I know somebody walked in near the end of the presentation, and we don't have a second presentation tonight. Our second speaker had to drop out at the last minute, so sorry for getting you out here for 10 minutes. But hopefully,
If people have the time and interest, I know I have a couple questions I'd like to ask
Absolutely.
about security in an enterprise or in a company. How they protect everything.
yeah, turn that off.